Hi, everybody. My name is Carol Giacomo, and I'm the editor of Arms Control Today. I am delighted to be the one to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mallory Stewart, who's the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. These are among her second, public remarks since she assumed the role. And we hope that you will take this opportunity to ask her questions. There are cards on the table, so feel free to please write down your questions, and my colleagues will pick them up. Assistant Secretary Stewart joined the Bureau in 2022 after serving as Special Assistant to President Biden and Senior Director for Arms Control, Disarmament, and Nonproliferation at the National Security Council. Prior to joining the NSC, she was the Senior Manager for Global Nuclear Security and Nonproliferation at the Center for Global Security and Cooperation at Sandia National Laboratories. From 2015 to 2017, Ms. Stewart was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy, also at ABC. Before that, she was an attorney advisor in the Department of State's Office of Legal Affairs beginning in 2002. Among her signature accomplishments was her role as lead lawyer on the negotiations that led to the 2013 U.S.-Russian framework for the elimination of serious chemical weapons. And with that, I give you Mallory Stewart.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Arms Control Association for inviting me here. It's truly an honor. And congratulations on the 50th anniversary of this great association. As we just heard twice, you have very much to be proud of. Over the last half-century, you have worked to develop and advocate for solutions to the most pressing international security challenges, and you have cultivated multiple generations of national security experts, both inside and out of government. 50 years ago, in 1972, few would have believed that the US and Russian inspectors would now be conducting on-site inspections of each other's strategic nuclear forces, that our efforts to prevent a cascade of nuclear proliferation would be more successful than not, that our US national nuclear stockpile would be nearly 23,000 weapons fewer than they were in 1972, and that the tradition of non-use of nuclear weapons would extend for 77 years. None of these developments were inevitable. The combination of vocal and vibrant debate among civil society and the expert community, important attention from academia, shrewd diplomacy, and credible deterrence has helped us to manage the existential danger of nuclear weapons. While we should take pride in these accomplishments, we must acknowledge the setbacks and recommit to face the major obstacles to national security, strategic stability, and arms control efforts going forward. As we've all been witness to, and as you've discussed much today, these challenges continue to grow. Russia is waging a brutal war of aggression in Ukraine, and European security is more challenged than at any time since World War II. Russia has dramatically demonstrated its willingness to violate arms control obligations and security assurances, and nuclear saber rattling has featured prominently in Russian attempts to deter the world from assisting Ukraine. The People's Republic of China is rapidly building a larger, more diverse nuclear arsenal. The accelerating pace of the PRC's nuclear expansion may allow it to have up to 700 deliverable nuclear weapons in the next 5 years and at least 1,000 by 2030. This would exceed the pace and size that the US projected just 2 years ago in 2020. And this growth is made even more concerning by the complete lack of transparency of the PRC regarding its stockpile. More alarming, perhaps, is that through their actions and campaigns to disseminate disinformation, Russia and China seem to be actively working to subvert the rules-based international order and to construct a different reality, one more favorable to authoritarian governments. North Korea continues to prioritize its weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs over the well-being of its people, and we continue to work towards Iran's return to full implementation of its JCPOA commitments. Amid the resurgence of strategic competition with China and Russia, their efforts to weaken the international rules-based order, the continued development of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs, and the stalemate in our discussions with Iran, many have understandably grown frustrated with the lack of progress in global nuclear disarmament. Although the size of the US nuclear stockpile is down 88% from its peak in 1967, there is no clear indication that Russia or China are ready to engage with us in good faith, either to enable deeper reductions in our collective strategic capacities or even to prevent miscalculations and reduce risks going forward. What's more, the appreciation and the understanding in the US domestic audience, political arena, and in the international community for what arms control can achieve has diminished somewhat. The understanding that arms control can strengthen deterrence and is often required to achieve stability has waned. But what I know and what this community well knows is that these obstacles are not insurmountable. We know that arms control, and especially nuclear arms control, is right now more important than ever, as we heard from President Biden. During international crises, when misunderstandings, mistrust, miscommunication, and arms races thrive, and when escalation is both intentional and unintentional, is when we most need the collective efforts and knowledge of this community. What we also inherently understand is that arms control can take many forms to work in many different contexts. These tools include attribution and accountability mechanisms, transparency and confidence building measures, reliable and credible channels of communication, joint statements, unilateral or reciprocal non-binding commitments, and of course, verifiable international agreements and treaties. These tools have worked, as we saw in the video, and will continue to do so. Even in today's complicated security environment, we see examples of arms control mechanisms reducing risk. For example, while the New START Treaty was indeed negotiated during a different climate of relations with Russia, its legally binding limits continue to constrain Russia from significantly expanding the number of warheads loaded onto its ICBMs and SLBMs. Continued compliance and transparency provisions in New START ensured that we were not surprised or alarmed when Russia conducted a routine test of its developmental Sarmat missile, despite Putin's attempt to cast the launch in an intimidating light. And even the January 2022 P5 statement from earlier this year on preventing nuclear war and avoiding arms races demonstrates the continued utility of our diverse arms control toolkit. In that statement, Russia, China, France, the UK, and the US affirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The 5 nations recognized that nuclear use would have far-reaching consequences and expressed the intent, quote, to continue seeking bilateral and multilateral diplomatic approaches to avoid military confrontations, strengthen stability and predictability, increase mutual understanding and confidence, and prevent an arms race that would benefit none and endanger all. As a result of this statement, Russia is on the record affirming a set of principles that is now clearly violating. We must highlight Russia's disdain and marshal the support of the entire international community to condemn Russia for its reckless nuclear saber rattling. And China, too, appears unwilling to live up to the elements of that P5 statement, most clearly in its continued resistance to bilateral dialogue on strategic risk. Reducing strategic risk is an obligation that nuclear weapon states owe to the world. It is in all of our interests to work on this together. Unfortunately, some think that arms control is at odds with deterrence, or even national security as a whole. Indeed, some observers treat arms control and nuclear deterrence as separate and competing approaches to national security. Some even go as far as to describe them as opposing camps. I think we need to examine this. This administration views arms control and deterrence as mutually reinforcing and overlapping. They represent 2 complementary elements within a single integrated strategy to prevent war, avoid arms races, and stop the spread of nuclear weapons. Our efforts to deter are more effective and more successful when we have greater clarity about the capabilities, posture, operations, and strategies of our potential adversaries. Our efforts to defend ourselves are most efficient when we are spared the pressure to buy and deploy ever-increasing weapon systems purely for the sake of matching or exceeding the other side's numbers. And our efforts to prevent unintentional escalation and even to head off intentional escalation are only successful if we can communicate reliably and clearly in peacetime and in crisis. In contrast, accelerating proliferation, diminishing communications, and the absence of transparency is rarely a formula that results in greater security or stability. The mutually reinforcing relationship between deterrence and arms control is at the heart of the Biden-Harris administration's balanced approach to these issues. With our national security and the security of our partners and allies as the overarching objective, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent and a strong and credible extended deterrent commitment. At the same time, we will continue to emphasize the need for strategic stability, seek to avoid costly arms races, and facilitate risk reduction and arms control arrangements wherever possible. We have an ambitious but achievable vision for the future, one that will enhance the security of the United States, our allies and partners, and the global community. So how do we achieve this vision? With Russia, we have explained our goals for next steps in nuclear arms control, and those have not changed. We want to sustain limits beyond 2026 on the Russian systems covered under New START. We want to limit the new kinds of nuclear systems Russia is developing, and we want to address all Russian nuclear weapons, including theater range weapons. Expanding arms control to cover these theater range weapons is critically important, since Russia is more likely to threaten or actually use these weapons during a conflict. And these weapons are presently not constrained by any agreement, nor does Russia have any arms control commitments or obligations to even provide transparency regarding its stockpile, which is on par or greater than the number of deployed weapons accountable under New START. Former U.S. Undersecretary of State Rose Gottemuller once referred to theater range weapons limitations as the holy grail of the arms control community, and addressing these weapons certainly will not be easy. We are working hard within the interagency and with partners and allies to analyze the full range of complex issues at play, and I'm confident we will be ready with an effective and workable approach. But technical solutions and capacities are not sufficient without political will, and progress will be difficult without a willing partner in Russia. With China, though very different on many levels, we do face a similar political will challenge. Attempts to engage in bilateral and multilateral discussions on managing and reducing strategic risks have been met with stiff PRC resistance. China appears unwilling to engage while it is rushing to expand its arsenal. And now that that arsenal has surpassed the size of those of the UK and France and is on pace to be larger than both combined, Beijing's time to be transparent and engage meaningfully on risk reduction has come. The United States has been working with like-minded partners to highlight the benefits to both China and Russia that risk reduction and mutual restraint measures, improve crisis communications, information sharing, and guardrails can provide. 21st century strategic stability requires that we find creative ways to address each side's differing threat perceptions, but all sides must engage. Arms control cannot be a one-way street. We cannot simply wait for Russia and China to deem it in their interest to engage in good faith. Raising awareness about those countries' nuclear behavior is key to creating global pressure to choose stability over nuclear threats and arms racing. Building understanding of why arms control measures are crucial for national and international security is another way to encourage engagement on these issues, and we cannot hesitate to call both Russia and China to account, while we ensure we are prepared with credible arms control and risk reduction proposals when they are ready to engage. So I will end with a call to action from Joe Biden delivered to this community 20 years ago at the annual ACA meeting in 2002. At that meeting, then Senator Biden explained that in order to achieve our arms control and non-proliferation objectives, quote, we must loosen the bonds of ideology. We must invent new approaches and foster new international cooperation to meet the changing threats. Then and to this day, President Biden continues to call upon us to work together as a team. National leaders, NGOs, academia, politicians, diplomats, military officials, governments of nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states alike. President Biden has asked us to put aside ideology and perceived divisions between our efforts to reach a world without nuclear weapons, to put aside different backgrounds and historical conflicts, cultural differences or assumptions, and build on our successes. We need to diversify our perspectives and be creative to explore how new technologies can help develop innovative approaches to verification and how new techniques or arrangements can ensure collective confidence and stability. We need to explore novel arms control concepts to better understand their potential and their effectiveness. And we need to value attribution and accountability mechanisms and maximize the utility of communication channels and dialogues. But we also need to clarify rules of responsible behavior to define what good behavior is in gray zone of conflict so we can clearly see and hold accountable when bad behavior occurs. We need to continue to grapple with the challenging and undefined world of emerging disruptive technologies, and we should use the rising tide of concern on this issue. Finally, we all need to break through the webs of disinformation and deceit to hold Russia accountable for its unjustified invasion of Ukraine and nuclear saber-rattling, and to hold China accountable for rejecting good faith efforts to engage on strategic risk reduction. But we need your partnership. We need you to help remind the domestic and international audiences of the importance of arms control. We need you to continue to support the administration's commitment to reestablishing a leadership role in arms control and nonproliferation efforts, while working to modernize and replace New START when it expires. We need your help to hold all nuclear weapon states accountable for progress in arms control. And looking out at this august crowd, I know you will. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Well, you certainly have given us a lot to probe there. The very same then Senator, now President, that you quoted at the end also said at that dinner that pursuing arms control is not a luxury or a sign of weakness, but an international responsibility and a national necessity. Now, we've heard here today that strategic stability talks with the Russians are in the deep freeze for the foreseeable future. Under what circumstances would you consider resuming this dialogue?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an important question because when we engaged the final time with Russia in January of this year, we demonstrated our good faith in talking about each and every one of the articles in their proposed treaty. We addressed as seriously as we could all of their issues, and we tried to propose a path forward on those that we could accomplish, and we tried to realistically respond on those that were not tenable and not really realistic. We engaged in good faith, and we brought the interagency and our partners and allies to the same place in being able to respond and engage with Russia. We asked one thing, that they engage with us in good faith and demonstrate like-minded willingness to continue a dialogue and a conversation and not to invade Ukraine. They left that discussion and within a month had invaded Ukraine. And so it's very hard right now to understand how we can sort of acknowledge and accept that they would be willing to engage with us in good faith with such a demonstration of an inability to absorb what we were trying to work with them on and to respond to us in a way that demonstrates that dialogue and diplomacy had a chance. I think if there was some way to indicate good faith on their side, if there was some way to indicate that the dialogue would be more meaningful than just another meeting in Geneva, we could consider something. But I think at this point, with their illegal invasion of Ukraine and their continued horrific, I think as Tom mentioned, 17th century activities, it's very hard to figure out how we can sit and think that our diplomacy will be taken seriously on that side. So until we get some indication of good faith or some willingness to actually provide, assurances that they are willing to give diplomacy a chance, I just don't know how we can meet with them again on this.
All right, so we're looking at a period where there's just an indefinite nothingness there. Does this make track 2 conversations more important? Is that something that you would encourage?
I mean, I think track 2 conversations are always important. Mm-hmm. I think regardless of the situation, it's useful to have the outside community talking, engaging on both sides. I will say that we are still implementing New START, as is Russia, and that's very important. Mm-hmm. I think that any way we can sort of inch toward continued communications, as President Biden said in his statement, now during crisis is when they're more important than ever. But again, with the SSD, which I care very deeply about, and I know that, everyone at the State Department and our partners and allies care very deeply about that dialogue. It's very hard to convince, everyone to engage, again, without some legitimate, willingness on the Russian side to demonstrate seriousness.
All right, but even if one were to accept your point, your argument, you're facing a deadline with New Start, and it's fast coming, to that time. Yes. So what's your plan B with that? I mean, is there, do you see the possibility of a unilateral U.S. declaration that you would continue to adhere to the New Start limits as long as Russia did?
I think we need to consider all of the available options going forward, right? I am not willing to give up on the ability to negotiate next steps beyond New Start at this point. I think right now during this conflict, it's very hard to figure out how we do that. And we just saw some communications from various folks across the U.S. government about figuring out how we do this. So my bureau is actively working to sort of figure out what we could put forward should the opportunity arise. But we should keep all options open for what we can do moving forward. So I don't think we should sort of right now figure out what is the right path, because I think there could be other venues or opportunities. But I think we should hope to engage at some point with a good faith interlocutor and try to achieve next steps.
One more from me, and then we'll go to the audience. But the nuclear posture review still has, it's still classified. Yep. And there's a fact sheet that, of course, tells us that the president has canceled the nuclear SLICM. Can you explain the rationale for that?
So yes, it was a whole of government decision. There was a very extensive Department of Defense-led nuclear posture review working group that considered across the board all of the existing systems or those in train, and collectively made the recommendation to the president that this particular system didn't make sense to continue going forward. So it was, several bases for that. I think we've just recently heard from the Department of Defense again that it, was a large amount of money. It was blocking out other capacities. It was not seen as useful in several contexts. So it was the recommendation to the president that he accepted.
Okay. All right, so this is a question from the audience. How will the war in Ukraine affect the set of issues that the U.S. and Russia discuss in the framework of the stability dialogue, if and when it ever happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will affect everything that we discuss. I think it affects all of us because it is very hard to argue in the arms control community that our dialogues have effect if our one request that they're taken seriously is so easily overturned once our interlocutors leave the table. So I think we need to really rebuild the understanding that these dialogues are in our interest, of course, and in Russia and others' interests. And so we need to establish that they are effective and that they can achieve something. I think the biggest challenge that I've seen in what happened after the SSD in January is some people using this phrase that makes no sense to me, that it was a dialogue for dialogue's sake, right? There should never be a dialogue or engagement just for the sake of engagement. You're engaging to build a relationship. You're engaging to encourage communications about your positions and your understandings and to explain what definitions mean to you and where your red lines are and where your challenges exist and what you need to work on. And so when this phrase dialogue for dialogue's sake comes back, which I find very harmful, I think that's a challenge to our entire community. And so that will affect us. I think we have to start reestablishing the goodwill of interlocutors at the table early and often.
Okay. Are there any other failures other than the war in Ukraine that have stymied the dialogue? Or that's the main reason, right?
Well, that's the most significant one that I can think of. I think the challenge of our relationship with Russia has become more difficult due to disinformation, due to ongoing positioning that has become more oppositional over the last several years. I think we have to address all of that. Ultimately,
the challenges we face in disinformation affect everyone, including Russia. When you take down the rules-based order by trying to deny accountability, by hiding facts, or to create new facts that don't exist, ultimately the lack of rules will come back to bite you. I mean, that's just, it's going to affect all of us. So these are challenges that I think we all have to recognize and try to overcome as we discuss with each other moving forward.
Can the sanctions on Russia be used to press Russia to the negotiating table on nuclear weapons issues, including tactical systems? And the questioner says, they seem open-ended enough for them to be possible.
I mean, I think, there's a lot of different reasons for sanctions, but if there is a way to have the sanctions help us engage in good faith conversations, then that will be a useful use of them, right? We've seen sanctions have some effectiveness in other arenas to do just that, to force parties to discuss ways to change or lift or allow for some exception to sanction regimes. So, hopefully they can be utilized for a benefit in that way, but, it remains to be seen.
Sorry, but I'm having the same trouble Kelsey had reading some of the writing. To what extent has Ukraine's refusal to pragmatically withdraw its application to NATO contributed to the tragedy due to Russia's aggression? To what extent has Ukraine's refusal to withdraw its application to NATO contributed to the tragedy of Russia's aggression? I
mean, I think from my limited perspective, it seemed like Russia was planning this anyway, right? The timing, right? The idea that there was any change in sort of Ukraine's NATO status at that time, February 24th, doesn't make sense to me. We had seen, as the US government had actively shared with others, a buildup of capacity in Russia, a buildup of almost preparation for this war for some time. I don't think that it's realistic to say that Ukraine's actions with respect to its application or non-application changed what Russia wanted to do in this circumstance anyway. I think it was just one of the useful excuses for Russia to try to justify its illegal invasion.
Okay. Well, there are many more questions, as one would expect there are, but apparently our time is up. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Assistant Secretary Stewart.